That they were there to protect them. But instead, what happened was they set fire to the school buildings and proceeded to destroy them, everything in them, and simply remove the girls, over 300, and pack them, as it were, into these vehicles. And nobody could really understand what was happening or could make sense of this kind of situation. But this whole thing happened over a period of 4 hours, during which time villagers and family members frantically tried to get in touch with members in Abuja, elsewhere, and to try and do something about that. But that didn't happen. So the girls were removed and taken away to a place that near or on the edge of Sambisa Forest, which is in the north of the state, and it takes about 24 hours to get there. And during that time, villagers, were reporting what was happening and passing on information, but nothing happened. And you can see here on the map the 3 states, Yobe, Borno, and Adamawa. Borno is the state in which Chibok is located, and that's been the worst affected by the violence. The actors that we're talking about, apart from Boko Haram, which is, it's not a group that is has a singular formation, as it were. There are several factions, but the leader, the one who is said to be the leader anyway, is one you may have seen on videos and has made various pronouncements on that. When this at the time that this happened, it took some days before anything was said, but there was no immediate response from the government, except when, after a few days, the military put out a statement that the girls had been rescued except for 8. So most people breathed a sigh of relief, but that was short-lived because the principal was the one who basically pointed out this hadn't happened. No girls had been rescued, and in fact, the ones who had come back were ones who had escaped. And the security agencies didn't seem to be doing anything. This is also in the context of federal and state governments working in tension, shall we say. The states in the northeast are run by opposition party governments. So there's a tension between what's happening there and how the presidency has responded and interpreted the whole situation. But basically, the response from government has been inaction or denial. And in the face of this, women and various women's organizations got together and basically said, you know, we can't let this happen. We can't just allow a situation where so many girls are abducted and nothing is done about it. So the Bring Back Our Girls protest began on the 29th of April. And they've been taking place all over the country. So this wasn't simply northern women responding to an atrocity that happened in the north of the country, given that there have been serious regional divides, political, social, economic, and so on, between the north and south of the country. So there have been protests, you know, across the country, and within Nigeria, regionally as well as beyond Nigeria. And as I mentioned earlier, in order to make sense of this violence that had been perpetrated against these young girls and Boko Haram's specific and directed effort to against what they call Western education, and you know, their very definite effort to try and prevent girls from going to education, from being educated. We have to understand the conditions that give rise to such a phenomenon. And Nigeria, although it's rich in natural resources, is actually a country where the majority of people are poor. Over 70% live in poverty. And this is the result of a long period of improper governance, where basically those who run the country loot a lot of the resources. Military rule has dominated the political scene, and it's only relatively recently that there's been, since '99 actually, that there's been a succession of civilian governments. But in all of this, the culture of violence has been, you know, one that has been perpetrated both at the political but also at the social level. And within that, religion has been used by Muslims as well as Christians, you know, in those in authority, that is, and particularly those trying to get into political office. So religion has formed the basis for different groups, you know, manipulating it and trying to gain followers. And Boko Haram have justified their actions in terms of Islam, but that has been challenged on many fronts. And all of this has fed a widespread ethos of misogyny and violence against women, not only within the context of religion, but beyond that, perpetrated by men in positions of authority, but also in homes and on the street, in offices, and so on. Boko Haram, I should point out, is a group that not only operates in Nigeria, but also across the Sahel. So they've been implicated in the uprising in Mali. They've also attacked a prison in Niger and attacked groups in Cameroon. So their project extends beyond the borders of Nigeria. But what makes it possible for them to carry out these kinds of attacks and so on, apart from the social conditions of deepening inequality, there's also the broader context of conflict in other parts of the continent. So apart from Mali, the Central African Republic, DRC, Libya, South Sudan, and so on. All these places are awash with arms, and so it's not that difficult for insurgent groups to get hold of them. And on the part of the US, there's also the interest of Africa, which Amina will say a bit more about later. Now, in terms of responses and challenges to what's happening, Nigerian women have really been in the leadership of the Bring Back Our Girls protest, but they've also organized with men. So I referred to various rallies and protests, marches across the country. They've engaged key actors in government, so the security agencies, different arms of the security agencies, but also the state government, and we did try to also engage the presidency, although that didn't quite happen, but we were met with by a delegation of ministerial representatives. And then on the Enough is Enough website, there's what will become a citizens' charter of demands to end terrorism, because that's really at the heart of what is happening here and is what gives rise to these kinds of actions. Beyond Nigeria, women have organized on the continent, so we see feminist solidarity within the sub-region, Senegal, Ghana, other countries in Africa, South Africa, and so on. And Grasta Michelle wrote a very inspiring letter to the Chibok schoolgirls and the parents, pointing out that really it's the responsibility at the end of the day of the Nigerian government to bring back our girls, no matter what support is accepted from the outside. At the end of the day, it's the president who is the is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and the presidency that has the responsibility for the security of people. At other levels, there are regional bodies like ECOWAS, the Economic Union of West African States, and the African Union, but we haven't heard much from them, and they really should be the ones who, should be coming out with responses to the problem. And it's interesting that the heads of state of Nigeria, Cameroon, Niger, and Chad were able to respond to a summit located in Paris, but not so much to what was happening in country and in the sub-region, which says a lot about the kinds of relations there. Beyond Africa, Bring Back Our Girls has become a global campaign. So at that level, the organizing has really gone viral. And here, it's a combination of many things. The Twitter campaign was very important and useful, but it would not have had the impact it had if it hadn't been matched by the physical presence of protesters out on the street in rallies, marches, and so on. And these have been held in many countries, in Europe, in the US, in South America, and so on. At another level, various countries have offered help, military help of different kinds. What we really don't want are boots on the ground, because that would not help the situation in the Northeast. It would radicalize those who are currently not part of Boko Haram to actually to resist that kind of foreign intervention. But it does reiterate the importance that no one else can usurp, really, of the Nigerian government responding adequately and appropriately. Boko Haram itself has been condemned by the Organization of Islamic Countries. They sent a delegation to Nigeria to say that what they were doing cannot be condoned by Islam in any way. And even Al-Qaeda seems to have distanced itself, if not condemned, what Boko Haram has done. So in terms of the actions that are needed, there are different kinds of actions needed at different levels. The only way, really, in which the girls could come back to Nigeria would be through negotiation, because a military action is simply unlikely to be successful. There are too many girls and probably dispersed in too many places for that to work. and the risk of girls being killed and so on is too high. So negotiation, although many governments say they don't do it, you know, up front, behind the scenes something else happens, and we've seen that recently in the US and elsewhere. Nigerians themselves have different ideas about what needs to be done to end terrorism in terms of reforming the military, changes that need to happen there. But what's really important at another level, which doesn't seem to be being given as much attention as it should, is the need to address economic and social changes, a Marshall Plan, the equivalent of, for the Northeast specifically, given the poverty, the level of social inequality and deep divides. But at the same time, an anti-poverty plan for the whole country, because it's not just the Northeast that is you know, faces problems. And in fact, insurgency and conflict of different kinds are experienced all over Nigeria, not just in the Northeast. It's that the scale of the violence against women and the abductions are so enormous in Chibok that you know, this particular incident has galvanized so much attention. But other things that need to be addressed are things like youth unemployment, the overhauling the education system, and within all of that, not losing sight of all of that, but contextualizing it in this broader scenario, addressing violence against women, and that's at different levels. Impunity, so the legal and justice system, need to take that on board. Prevention, various kinds of initiatives there, and addressing trauma, specifically trauma around sexual violence. Beyond national initiatives, there are sub-regional and global ones. So the Nigerian government needs to work with neighboring governments like Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and so on. What's happening in Iraq is very frightening. The conditions that give rise to ISIS there are very similar to those that have given rise to Boko Haram, and their demands seem to be uncannily similar. The whole questions of how many arms and how much equipment for waging war is available and awash in conflict-ridden countries is key, is critical here. And we know that most of these arms come from the global north, not from the global south. Large financial flows, you know, where's the money coming from? That's another question. And within all of this, addressing violence against women, impunity, prevention, but also supporting locally based initiatives, because in terms of prevention and addressing trauma, those are most grounded. And at the end of the day, what does really matter, or at this point, is the continuing demand and pressure, whether local, national, regional, international, to simply bring back our girls. That's where we are now.
Thank you very much, Charmaine, for that wonderful presentation that brought together various pieces of the story. At what actually happened to the girls, and then thinking about the various macro and global forces that gave rise to what's happening, and not the least of which you're talking about the need for overall social development of the country, thinking about a redistribution of resources and wealth, because as everyone knows, Nigeria is a very wealthy country on both non-materially and non-materially. So, you know, how do we need to think about inequalities? And finally, really, I'd like to ask the audience to think about this question of, you know, what's the relationship between neoliberal capitalism, religious fundamentalisms, and violence against women? We'll now move to Amina Mama, who will add another layer to the story. Amina, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Margot. I think you gave me a perfect entry point transnational feminist perspectives on the global scenario actually point to those three things and the linkages between contemporary neoliberal capitalism, or if you like, market fundamentalism, and the production of cultural fundamentalism and militarization. So these three things we see as definitely playing out in relationship to each other and producing some of the horrifying events that are characterizing the early 21st century, particularly in southern context, but everywhere in different locations in different ways. So thank you. I mean, I think one of my questions, which I'd like people to think about as I share a few remarks with you, is, what are the conditions under which a little localized group of dissenters from modernity, dissenters from global empire, a little small localized group of dissenters have become, in a matter of 4 years, an organization that is considered a threat globally, classified as a global terrorist organization. How did that journey, how did that escalation happen, and what were the conditions that made that so? So how do we move from local insecurity to global terror? And so for me, that is a very dramatic escalation. And to understand it, as Charmaine's made some reference to history, I think we need to take note of it. 30 years of military rule. Not just military rule, but as we were looking at in the early 90s, what does military rule do for a society? And I think when we look at Nigeria today, we can say it's been 15 years since the end of military rule and the transition to civilian governance, but the political culture has really not made the leap of the transformative leap that it needs to do. So we still have a very militarized polity. Military personnel are very much in the background of contemporary politics. And some of the things that women were campaigning against during military rule included addressing the fact that politics was so corrupt and so monetized, and at that time completely commanded by the military. And I want to suggest that the military, if you look at the budgets of the national budgets and so on, that still play a huge role in Nigerian politics. And the legacy of military rule is very much a factor. Coming to the abductions, the next slide, the trauma, the fact that the only girls who've been recovered are those who ran through the escaped and made their way through the bush and survived to get back to make contact and rejoin their families. And they must still be fearing for their security because, as Charmaine mentioned, the abductions have continued in other villages in that community, and they're continuing to be affected. So there you have them covered, not because they want them veiled, but because the insecurity is persisting. And then there's been a high level of grief, next slide, and distress. If anyone can find these pictures. So these are the immediacies, the grief, the terror, the distress. And then Charmaine's already outlined the complete inaction by national security forces. And I find this shocking, not just because the military are probably the biggest and strongest institution, even in our civilian dispensation, but because they have the most enormous budget. And this is one of the legacies. The military, despite their huge budget, their huge size, apparently are unable to provide minimal security to vast swathes of Nigeria today. I don't know what we're supposed to make of this. How can a country with that scale, that size and scale of a military, not be able to protect its citizens? So the insecurities, I think, first of all, this raises the whole question of whether a conventional military are any use at all in dealing with this kind of problem. And then we need to look at what insecurity and security mean. Clearly, conventional security, which is what the military might be expected to provide, has failed. But then, if we want to think what would security look like in a place like this, I think we would be compelled to look at the human security factor, and specifically women's security. And we all know this, if you ask women about security, they don't say they want security guards or protection from invasion. They say they want food, education, welfare. Now the neighborhood, Charmaine mentioned that it's poor. People there live on less than $2 a day. It's ironic that Boko Haram want to prevent Western education because it has the highest illiteracy rates in the country as well. So this is an area that's been historically very, very marginalized. And I want to say that even during the brief days of British colonialism, there were parts in the northeast of Nigeria that were never pacified and were always considered impassable. And this region is in that terrain. So neither the colonials nor the military have ever had full governance of the area, and they've been grossly neglected. So the deterioration, the poor quality of infrastructure, communication structure, all these things place local people who are really left to fend for themselves, both in terms of their livelihoods, in an area that is affected by climate change, but then also not protected in any way. You know, little wonder that Nigerians are taking this as the latest instance. And, you know, because as Charmaine mentioned, there's been a long history of ongoing very high levels of societal violence. And this is a recent manifestation of violences that are quite deeply rooted. I would suggest that there is a culture of misogyny alive and well, despite 15 years of civilian rule. I would suggest that civil society has a deeply problematic gender politic, and we've seen this in the calls for Sharia law. It's only 10 years since a series of women were sentenced to death by local Sharia courts. So I'm saying not that the society is like Boko Haram, but Boko Haram is an exaggeration. In a way, it manifests the extremes of a discourse that is present in certain sections in Nigeria. And I would like to suggest that's a product of marginalization, neglect, and lack of Western education, or let's say lack of modern education, because we've owned it ourselves for a long time now. So these are some of the conditions. So the picture is one in which human insecurity is very, very poor, and national instability is now under quite serious threat. Can move on to the next slides. Yeah, so the picture is mapped out very well here. And these are separate from what's gone on in the oil delta, which is to the south below the area that you're looking at, which has been marked up with current attacks. So moving on, looking at the global response, first of all, we're very glad that a global campaign happened and has exposed this gross neglect in terms of security in the region. But at the same time, it's very clear that military response, because Nigeria is heavily militarized, the military have not been the best response. So I see no reason to believe that responses by other military forces less familiar with the terrain will be any more effective. But the U.S. response, I think, needs to be put in the context of the AFRICOM project. I think it was George Bush in 2007 launched the idea of establishing a U.S. military high command on the African continent. This project was rejected, and both governments and African civil society pushed back against it. But nonetheless, if you go to the next slide, you'll see that despite there not being a formal base anywhere in Africa except the large one, the yellow, in Djibouti, at the far right of the continent, and of course the base is out in Dego Garcia, but there has not been beyond Djibouti a military presence. And all of this, this map is actually from a research done in 2013, which looks at US military activity in Africa. So although the high command may not be there, there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of expenditure, and indeed this incident has led the Pentagon to promise a new vote for military support to Nigeria. So we expect more militarism, even though military responses have not been appropriate or effective. So I think we have good cause to be concerned about that. And I say this because I found a 2011 Congressional Home Security Committee report which already identified Boko Haram as a threat to homeland security in the U.S., as well as a threat to U.S. interests in access to natural resources, the resources they need anywhere in the world. So you know, if the U.S. defines its security in this way, it's of great concern to us. The changes, moving on to the next slide, in global military expenditure, which is huge, I mean so huge that 10% would probably have, it is said that 10% of the world military expenditure would have meant everyone in the world was housed, clothed and educated. But here are the figures. They're still very, very high. And the next slide shows you more cause for concern. Whereas military expenditure in North America and Europe is going down, the expenditure in the poorer parts of the world, which are now, if you like, the theaters of conflict and war, is rising. In Africa in particular, military expenditure is rising at the same time as we reach new levels of insecurity. So here we have a self-perpetuating cycle of violence and militarism, and things are getting steadily worse. This suggests we need to consider security very, very differently. So I think that's one of my main concerns. The connection to women's rights is, and right now I mentioned misogyny, a culture in which women are trivialized, commodified, and otherwise abused, is intrinsic to all militarized political structures and systems. Wherever there's conflict, wherever there's a military state, gender inequality becomes much, much worse, both in the preparation for conflict, during conflict, and then post-conflict. So there's enough research out there on post-war, allegedly post-conflict situations which show the persistence of societal violence, and in particular the abuse, rape, and sexual violation of women. So these are an intrinsic feature of militarized cultures, which are the most extreme patriarchal conditions, impose the most extreme conditions. So it sets back democratization through its lower levels of public accountability around budgets, and it sets back the prospects for gender equality. And I would say it's to do with the nature of military regimes and military cultures and the persistence of that, even when a society has transitioned to civilian governance. Women continue to be underrepresented, and the abuse of women continues to be normalized at levels that are not acceptable. So I'll stop there so we can have some discussion. My last slide is looking at the comparative expenditures I just mentioned. And you can see 37% of the world's military expenditure comes from the US. And I'll just mention as a finale that their weapons are not really produced in Africa. So all these conflicts in Africa and the Middle East, the weaponry is coming through international criminal trading networks, but it's coming from outside. And as Charmaine said, that has to be stopped. But the weaponry is just one aspect of a bigger security problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Amina, and again, Charmaine, for your insights and new information. Just picking up on a couple of things that Amina mentioned, I want to just draw your attention to, this whole notion of humanitarian militarism that the U.S. military, the Defense Department, is using to promote bases and U.S. military interventions worldwide, actually. And thinking about, this whole question of national security and how much of the war on terror, the so-called war on terror, whether it's in the U.S. or Nigeria and other countries, is, supposed to promote some notion of national security. And I would ask the question, whose nation and whose security in that, that conceptualization? And then the third point is thinking about this worldwide political shift to the right, whether you're talking about European countries, U.S., African countries, countries in the Middle East, and a kind of a related religious shift to fundamentalisms of all kinds, and violence against women, marginalization of women, and actually drawing down women's rights. So I'd like to just open it up to questions, and until I get a couple, let me just ask a question that came in very early. Charmaine, you talked about negotiations, and that's an interesting point, because how do people who are situated asymmetrically in terms of power, what are the points of negotiations? You know, what is the community negotiating with Boko Haram or the government or whoever to get their girls back, or you know, getting other demands met?
The negotiations would be taking place at the level of the government with groups or individuals from Boko Haram. We don't really know much about how that might or is playing out. Normally that's something that's kept very secret. But Boko Haram have indicated that they would be interested at one point. I don't know if this is still the case, but there's reason to think that it is. Boko Haram have indicated that they would be interested in swapping some of the schoolgirls for prisoners. That is, their members who have been taken prisoner. The question then would be how many prisoners and how many girls and so on. So it gets quite complicated there. But yeah, the community is not in a position to enter into any negotiations. They've just been ravaged, really. So the government is the body that is in a position of negotiating a bit, you know, possibility.
Are grassroots women's groups in Nigeria and in other parts of the African continent, are they, in what ways are they involved? I see, you know, emails flying here and there, but I don't have a sense of what's happening in terms of the organizing. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Organizing around which aspect, Margot?
The shorter term aspect of, you know, returning the girls or getting the girls back, and then some of the perhaps the longer term organizing that's going on around some of the things that Amina spoke about, and the whole question of development.
Okay. Well, the different groups within the Bring Back Our Girls movement in Nigeria, but particularly those based in Abuja, have engaged different levels of government. So in Abuja, we've had marches and members of the leadership have also been in engagement with the National Assembly. So that's the legislature, the federal legislature, the National Security Advisor, the overall, who is supposed to be in charge of coordination of the overall security apparatus, the Chief of Defense Staff. They've also engaged with embassies of neighboring countries and the media and various bodies such as those. Outside of Abuja, there have been various protests and rallies in Lagos, for example, and other cities, basically making sure that the issue is kept on the burner and also recognized as something that concerns women and activists across the country, not just the North, because that's a very important point to make in the face of denial by several government-sponsored groups that the abductions took place in the, at all, and secondly, somewhat feeble attempt to say that we should be asking Boko Haram to rescue the girls rather than calling on the government to bring back our girls. So, just resisting those sorts of efforts to really sweep the whole incident under the carpet has been very much on the agenda. But at another level, I've been involved with the Center for Women and Adolescent Empowerment, who are working with other groups in the Northeast on post-trauma interventions. So we're trying to put in place efforts to organize training for local counselors, for service providers providers who would be engaging in sexual trauma counseling and so on, basically lay the foundations for a network of support in the Northeast that's also linked to the campaign. And within that, we've also...
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Just finish your sentence. I'm sorry, Charmaine.
Yeah, we've also been thinking about, what needs to be put in place regarding economic and social development, but that's still ongoing. So.
Okay, thank you.
Margot?
I think we have some questions from the audience.
Yes, we do. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Yes, hi, this is Kirsten. I have a question from Kathy Gillette. AFRICOM reported in May that they sent a team to participate in a U.S. Department of State-led interagency coordination and assessment cell to identify any assistance and resources required by the Nigerian government to locate and recover the missing girls. What do we know about the results of this assessment, and are there tangible next steps? Did you get that?
Yes.
Yes, got it.
Who do you want to answer that?
No, go ahead, Amina, please.
Yes, no, I was going to say we did hear about the dispatch of 16 military personnel to advise the Nigerian government. I haven't seen anything about that, any report back or any report on what they were able to achieve as yet. I don't know. Charmaine, is there any news on the ground in Nigeria?
No, there isn't. There's been
Silence.
a lack of information, about how they would even relate with the Nigerian.
Another question. These are huge and ongoing global problems. This is from Pamela Pine. What would you say are the top 3 initial actions to take?
Charmaine, do you want to?
Can I come in here?
Yes, jump in, please.
Well, the problem is experienced globally as well as locally. And I don't think you can have a one-size-fits-all top 3 set of things that need to be done. But having said that, I do think that addressing, and when I say there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, what I mean is that the form it will take in different contexts will vary. But in terms of broad brush possibilities, it's very important to do something about social and economic development, about redressing inequalities, which I've referred to, whether it's poverty or the notion that women are inherently inferior to men and how that manifests at various levels, whether in terms of access to education or the violence that they might be subjected to, and so on. It's also very important to reform political institutions so that they do actively, actually operate as institutions and that can be held accountable. So whether it's the presidency or the government in power, political parties as a whole, and so on. And it's also important to reform militaries. I do think that militaries, when you're faced with nihilist forces, you do have to have a force that goes beyond citizens to engage with that. But one thing we do know from a lot of work on gender and conflict and so on is that conventional militaries with their central command and control rules and culture don't work effectively with when engaging with these kinds of insurgencies. And so how the military operates needs to be rethought, but also the relationship between military and security forces with people needs to be rethought. And fundamental to that is, as Amina has also has pointed out, is the whole notion of security and whose security. Security has conventionally been thought of as government, the security of the state, particularly of the government and the ruling party, not of people. Once you start thinking about a human-centered notion of security in practice as well as politically and intellectually, one in which women are as much a part of it as men, so it's not just men's security we're talking about, then you have a whole different array of things that could be done, and that's where the social and economic plans and mechanisms come in.
Thank you for that response. I have a long question from Raphael. U.S. policy has drastically changed from previous postures, specifically in regards to Nigeria targeting Boko Haram. How would you categorize the social online movement in regards to Bring Back Our Girls and the subsequent change of U.S. and global foreign policy posture? And aside from attaining global awareness, do you think that the actions so far reflected the proper measures to be taken, or has it stayed stagnant, perhaps due to other terrorist global issues, i.e. ISI in Iraq, or lack of resources? To explain the spread of extremism, certainly ruling governments, oppression and corruption makes religion, regardless of creed, a foundation to reduce dissonance and stress by the local population. This has led to extremist Islam to get a foothold in the country, making jihad attractive to the youth. A perfect example would be the threat of dynamics presented at the Sochi Olympics, reflecting years of corruption, oppression, marginalization affecting the area, in the area. How would you see this in terms of the local and global response against Boko Haram in terms of military response? Clearly, Putin hit the, I guess I should stop right there. We may...
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks. It's a complicated question. Does Amina, do you or Charmaine want to pick up on any one strand of that? What particularly jogged my curiosity is this assertion about the shift in the U.S. military posture. But please, Charmaine, and then Amina.
Well, I think that the online campaign has been very, very successful in terms of drawing attention to the problem and making it impossible for the Nigerian government to pretend that it had not happened, which seemed to be their position, certainly at the beginning and subsequently. However, going beyond drawing attention to the problem and putting pressure on the government to at least acknowledge its existence, there's the whole question of actually dealing with the problem. And this is where we are now. It's very, very difficult to really do that, in country, but externally, I think that the campaign should definitely continue, but in terms of the possibility of it addressing this second phase, as it were, its chances of engaging with that are more limited than in terms of drawing attention to the problem. I think globally, what the question then went on to ask about, or how do we make sense of the fact that these kinds of fundamentalisms and crises and conflict and so on are so widespread. A lot of it is rooted in the crisis of global capitalism and in the ways in which so many countries across the world really have treated national resources as basically personal resources. This is, and so government has become an avenue for gaining access to those resources, looting them, and in the process over long periods of time, and sometimes over relatively short ones. The problem of social inequality, people becoming frustrated and feeling that they have no stake in the nation, grows. And all of that comes together. You know, you yourself talked about the convergence of the capitalism, of militarism, and violence in relation to these different manifestations of violence against women that we see. And it's really trying to understand those in particular local contexts, the histories, the politics, the social and economic dimensions of that needs to happen for us to be able to work out what needs to be done differently in different local situations, but also what common actions could be taken at global and international levels.
Thank you very much. Let me just stop because it's 5 minutes to the hour, before the hour, and we're supposed to end at 1. We're willing to continue until 1:15 if so we'll just keep the conversation going. Anna, did you want to just say a few things in case some people do have to leave? Well, and let us continue this conversation for a bit.
We have quite a few questions, so it'd be good.
Right. We will continue the conversation a bit beyond for those who can stay on. I do want to invite you all to continue the online discussion on the WING community platform, discussion forum on our website, WNGE.fielding.edu. And like us and follow us on Facebook. And also we will be having part 2 and part 3 seminars on September 10th and October 8th, where we'll explore violence against women in the U.S. and around the world, and also everyday and everywhere violence and the feminist response to that violence. And we'll share some slides here so that you can refer to them later on the recording for how to impact change, which organizations to join. But I want to give our audience and panelists more opportunity to interact. So thank you for letting me interrupt. And Margot and Kirsten, go ahead and continue with the questions.
Okay, we have a question from
Kirsten.
All right, we have a question from Pamela Pine. Poverty and education and policy inequality issues are, yes, enormous. And where to start, say, in Nigeria? I know there are ongoing programs, but we have all been talking about this for a very, very long time. What's the best thinking on where to push forward the change to catalyze a true impact?
Education. Exactly the target of Boko Haram's campaign, for very good reason, is education. Because education will build up the capacities of societies to, first of all, improve their life chances. I mean, if we're talking about very poor and marginalized and impoverished areas, free access to public education is, mass education is critical. One might say this could never have developed the way it has if the place had not been pushed to the very margins of development. And there I'm talking about the education of both boys and girls. As I said, they abducted the girls, they slaughtered the boys. And boys who are not slaughtered are likely to be recruited. Other wars have broken out where you have 80% male unemployment and a patriarchal culture, which makes that deeply humiliating. So the shame of having no prospects, I think, is a factor in the ease with which militias are forming in very poor and impoverished parts of the world. And the heavy-handedness of conventional security. I mean, the Nigerian army went in and killed the precursors to Boko Haram, the small community that initially dissented. That heavy-handed response has produced further militarism at local level. And then the ineptness of the national army, compounded by the fact that vigilantes are taking matters into their own hands and massacred a lot of other people, and then being congratulated by government. So what you're seeing here is a breakdown of security. And it's a very frightening situation. So I would say, first of all, education. Now, this may never have happened had structural adjustment not not force the government to withdraw public spending, so that education, social welfare, social development have all been undermined while the military have continued to be huge. So the approach to development needs to be changed. Social development and education offer ways of inoculating and reducing the vulnerability to conflict.
Thank you, Amina.
Can I come in here?
Thank you. More questions?
Charmaine?
Yes, sure, Charmaine.
I think that it's important to emphasize that we will be talking here about education as the practice of freedom, because the current form of education that's in place across Nigerian school systems and even in many universities is basically where people who think critically, who are prepared to challenge received wisdom and dissent from the status quo, are not received warmly. So, you know, if education means simply replicating what is there already, it will not help. But so really there also needs to be a change of mindset, a change of people's sense of what it means to be in the world. And I think that some of that is more likely to happen through political education and movement building, which also involves people who do value critical thinking and education of this more liberatory type, than currently trying to get it through the official policy avenues. When you have a situation that's you know, so fraught and complex, and where there is so little political will to change the status quo as currently exists in Nigeria, I think that you know, smaller pockets of resistance and challenging with an alternative vision of the future is what we need to build on, and through that come up with ideas and possibilities and practice for a different kind of society and different forms of education and value placed on human beings, on women and men, on security and all of that.
Thank you, Charmaine.
Thank you.
A two-part question from Charles Ugo. For Ms. Amina, how is it that Boko Haram's foundation influence and activities are prevalent during civilian rule in Nigeria? And for Charmaine, could you let us know how negotiations would work rather than boots on the ground? You talked about swapping prisoners. How would this be done so that it doesn't fuel or increase abduction rates? It seems to me that if we negotiate, as you pointed out, then Boko Haram will then see this as a leverage point for kidnapping and abducting more people, hoping that they will always negotiate their way out.
Thank you. I would like to say that the northern states, because they've been in a state of emergency for the last 2 years, have been under military rule in response to the question. And, you know, the argument I also developed was that Nigeria is still a very militarist and militarized place where the threshold of violence is very high. We're accustomed, since the Civil War, to very high levels of violence within the society. And I'm saying this is linked to a militarized culture that we are yet to transform.
Okay, if I come in here, yeah. I would also say, yeah, just in relation to that question about Boko Haram, civilian governments are not necessarily democratic governments, and the irony of this particular civilian government is that it has been one of the most militarized of civilian governments since 1999. Although the head of state is not a former military man, it's under his administration that we have military deployed in most of the states in the country, dealing with one form of conflict or another. So really understanding the history, the politics, and so on is critical for being able to contextualize any particular formation like Boko Haram, but also the acts that they carry out and what conditions make them possible. In relation, the second question was, remind me what that was. Hello?
Kirsten? Kirsten?
Yeah, Charmaine, this is Anna. It was about the notion, yes, it's Anna. The question really said, doesn't it reward further abduction if in fact negotiation is takes the form of trading prisoners for the girls?
Okay. Now I think what's important to recognize is that there are different kinds of actions that can be taken to address short-term goals, and these would not be the same as those addressing longer-term or broader span purposes. So the negotiation is specifically in relation to the Chibok girls, because such a heinous act took place, and it's not possible to just allow that to happen without making concerted and very determined efforts to bring the girls back. However, negotiation on its own can never be a strategy for dealing with violent insurgency of this type. And really, some of the things that I was talking about earlier in terms of reforming the military so that despite the huge budget that has been put aside, you know, ₦1 trillion last year and almost that amount this year, you find incidents of soldiers complaining of not getting their allowances on time, not being fed properly, not being properly armed or equipped in relation to Boko Haram, who have superior arms and so on, even though they're a smaller group. Just the ways in which the different agencies relate to one another, you know, like communication, but also being able to engage with this kind of insurgency means operating in a different way and relating differently to the communities in which they're located. So even taking on board what residents say about what's happening, you know, acting on information being provided to security agencies. There's a whole lot that could be done that isn't, well, we don't know whether it is or not, but we're not seeing any results really, in terms of acting on local intelligence, because it's community members who know what's happening, and there are actions that might be possible to preempt further violence that could be taken and that don't seem to be taken. These are a different order of things from negotiation. In the long term, negotiation is not a strategy for dealing with the overall insurgency, but in the short term, it's the only way we can think of actually getting the girls back.
Thank you, Charmaine. I have a question from Carolyn Kuseisman. Thank you both, Amina and Charmaine, for your informative talk. I know that many of the activists are also looking closely and talking about the upcoming 2015 elections. Can you talk more about how the upcoming elections and electoral period is interplaying with what's happening, both in terms of Boko Haram's attacks as well as the national government response?
Okay. The elections are in early 2015, February, I think. And one of the things that informs the government's response to what has been happening so far in the Northeast is the idea that the violence that's happening in that part of the country is the fault of the governors running those states, because those are all opposition party governors, governors from APC. And government supporters and other members have said that it is people from those states that threaten to make that part of the country ungovernable if their candidate did not win the last election. And so insecurity is being politicized here, which is not helping anyone. It's very short-sighted, but it's also totally inappropriate. And so this kind of impasse is something that's also apparently influencing the government's lack of will to really do anything for states whose governors don't belong to PDP states, the ruling party states. And they're making calculations about where they can get enough votes to win the election and so on. So it all feeds into those kinds of calculations, not the sort of thing that should be the priority given the precarious situation that not just the Northeast but the whole of the country is faced with.
Thank you. This is Anna.
I think we have time Amina for one more question. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, my recommendation would be, Margot, that we ask Amina and Charmaine to tell us about these organizations and how they can help us get involved to impact change in the short and the long term. There are 3 organizations on the screen, and I wondered if you would tell us a little bit about them.
Happily. Yeah. Because of the security situation on the ground there, I want to just mention one thing, which is that there have been women organizing across Nigeria for a very long time. We have a very good history of women organizing. It was women's movements that defeated the dress code bill. It was women's movements with obviously with male allies as well, that saw that no woman was ever stoned to death in Nigeria. And once again, we see women really leading an initiative for change. And not only are Nigerian women mobilizing en masse, but there are women mobilizing all over. I've seen wonderful images of women marching on the parliament in Cape Town and in other countries. So that's, in a sense, the limits of what international attention can do, and it's the best thing it can do is raise awareness and bring solidarity. And one of the organization I've put up there, Africa Women's Development Fund, is an ideal partner to work with in terms of how do we support people on the ground. And one of the issues is to give women's organizations and movements the support they've always deserved and needed to continue the work they do, campaigning against child marriage, against forced marriage, which has been regular, never mind abduction. So these have, if you like, a legacy of resistance, and the best way to get resources to them is through the Africa Women's Development Fund. So I'm putting that one forward as an immediate partner that deserves support. So for people who'd like to make donations, I recommend that one.
Thank you. Charmaine?
Bring Back Our Girls, the website, which is second on the list there, has a lot of information about different aspects of the movement, the media work that's being done. People can send messages of support and so on, and that really cannot be underestimated, particularly at times of great anguish. You know, Chibok was attacked a second time and has received threats for yet another attack to be carried out by the end of the week, and it's been over 2 months.
And there's still no security there.
Yeah. And it's been 65 days since the girls have been abducted, and in Abuja we've been organizing for 50 of those days. So, you know, messages of support and what people are doing to continue keeping the issue on the on the front burner, do make a difference to the morale of the groups and individuals organizing. And that's important because we really need to grow the movement locally. and nationally. But that's another thing that international support can really do. And whether it's Twitter messages or emails and so on, that can help. Enough is Enough is another very important organization. They came into being before and around the time of the protests around the use of government funds, or should I say the misuse of corruption and so on, the efforts to reduce or remove the fuel subsidy, you know, a declaration on the first day of the year in 2012, I think it was. And they were very instrumental in organizing that protest. They also have on their website the Citizens Charter for Citizen Solutions for Ending Terrorism, which is currently being reworked at the moment, but you know, that has 10 demands for addressing terrorism within the country.
This is Anna again, and I want to end by expressing Fielding and Wing's extraordinary thanks to you, Charmaine, to you, Amina, and to you, Margot, for really helping us understand the situation in a much deeper way, both deeper and broader. And I know that there are lots of questions and comments that we didn't get to, and that's why Kirsten has posted once again our discussion site. So please continue the discussion there, and also visit our website and follow us on Facebook, and join us again in the fall for the next two in the series of webinars. Thank you.
I'd like,
Go ahead, Mark.
can we just end with a question that's jumped into my head here, and that is for all of us to think as we move into the next two parts of the series, but beyond. I was wondering, you know, what kinds of social, political, economic structures and practices would create genuine human and ecological security throughout the world. So on that note, let's end, Anna. Thank you, Charmaine. Thank you, Amina.
A pleasure.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Good day.
Good day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.